The letter had arrived on a Tuesday. It was thin, folded once, sealed with wax the color of old blood. Clara Hinton did not open it immediately. She set it on the kitchen table beside her cold cup of tea and looked at it for a long moment, the way a person looks at something that they already know will change the shape of their day. The handwriting on the front was not hers. The name was. She picked it up, broke the seal, and read. The message was short. A nobleman by the name of Lord Edmund Fairfield was hosting a dinner gathering at his estate on the eastern edge of the city. He required a musician for the evening. A colleague of Clara's, a flautist she had played alongside at a hotel reception months before, had recommended her name. The fee was modest. The date was in 3 days. The expectation was clear. A simple waltz, something quiet and pleasing, music that would sit in the background like wallpaper. Nothing more. Clara folded the letter and slid it back into its envelope. She was 26 years old. She had been playing the violin since she was 4, which meant she had been playing for 22 years, which meant the instrument had been in her hands longer than any person had held her attention. She was not famous. She was not unknown. She occupied that particular space in the world of music that is perhaps the most difficult to live in, skilled enough to know exactly how far she had not yet gone, and talented enough to feel the distance like a physical ache. Her apartment was small. One room that served as a bedroom, a sitting room, and a practice room all at once. The window looked out over a narrow street where a baker's cart came through every morning at 6:30, and she had learned to play through the noise of it the same way she had learned to play through everything else, by deciding that the interruption was not an interruption at all, but simply the world doing what it did, and that music's job was not to avoid the world but to outlast it. On the wall above her writing desk there was a photograph. It showed a woman standing beside a grand piano in a concert hall mid-bow, her face tilted slightly down. The hall behind her was full, every seat occupied. The woman in the photograph was not Clara. It was her teacher, Edna Marsh, taken 30 years before, at the height of what had been a brilliant career. Edna had retired to a small house in the countryside after her husband became ill, and she had begun teaching. Clara had been her student for 7 years. Those 7 years were the spine of everything Clara knew. Edna had told her once, during a lesson that had stretched past midnight because neither of them had noticed the time, the music you are meant to play is not always the music you are asked to play. Those are two different things. You will spend a good portion of your life figuring out which is which. Clara thought about that often. She accepted the job. The morning of the dinner she woke before the baker's cart arrived, which told her that she had not slept as well as she had hoped. She lay in the gray light for a few minutes, listening to the city come slowly to life outside her window. Then she got up, made tea, sat at the kitchen table with the waltz score in front of her, and played through it in her mind without touching her instrument. It was a gentle piece, composed well, nothing wrong with it. It asked for nothing dramatic, promised nothing memorable, and delivered exactly what it promised. She set the score aside, opened her violin case, and played for 2 hours without looking at any sheet of music at all. What she played in those 2 hours was not the waltz. It was a composition she had been working through for the better part of 3 years, a piece she had first heard at a concert when she was 19, performed by a visiting musician whose name she had written on the back of her program ticket and kept in the case of her violin ever since. The piece was not gentle. It was not wallpaper. It moved through emotions the way a river moves through landscape, sometimes quietly, sometimes with a force that reorganized everything in its path. Playing it felt like being honest about something she usually kept to herself. She finished, set the violin down, and made herself another cup of tea. By 2 o'clock she had dressed, packed her violin, tucked the waltz score under her arm, and caught the tram across the city toward the Eastern District, where Lord Fairfield's estate sat behind its stone walls and iron gates. The tram was crowded. A man across the aisle from her was reading a newspaper. The woman beside Clara had a child on her lap who kept reaching for the violin case with small, determined hands. Clara moved the case gently out of reach, and the child looked at her with absolute seriousness, as though this was a personal matter. Clara looked back with the same expression. After a moment, the child broke into a smile. Clara did too. Small things. She had always paid attention to small things. It was something Edna had taught her, or perhaps had not needed to teach her at all. Perhaps it had always been there, the habit of noticing. The way light looked when it came through glass and landed on wood. The sound of a city block in the hour before noon. The expression on a child's face in the moment before a smile arrives. These were the things that ended up in the music, even when she was not aware of putting them there. The tram reached her stop, and she stepped off onto the pavement with her case in one hand and the score under her arm, and she walked the last quarter-mile to the estate on foot. The gates were open. A gravel path led to the main house, which was large and old and well-kept, with tall windows that caught the afternoon light and held it. Clara followed the path, and before she reached the front entrance, a side door opened and a woman in a dark uniform appeared and waved her over. "Musician," the woman said. "Yes," Clara said. The woman nodded, turned, and led her inside. They went through a corridor that ran along the back of the house, past a kitchen that smelled of stock and fresh bread, past a linen room, past several closed doors, and finally to a set of stairs that led upward to the main floor. "You'll wait in the antechamber," the woman said, pointing to a door at the top of the stairs. "Someone will come for you when it's time." "Thank you," Clara said. The woman had already turned and was walking back toward the kitchen. Clara stood at the top of the stairs for a moment. She could hear voices somewhere in the house, the low, easy murmur of people who were comfortable, who had come together in comfort and expected the evening to remain so. She heard the sound of glass against glass. She heard a man's laughter, brief and confident. She pushed open the door to the antechamber and went inside. It was a small room, a chair, a music stand, a narrow window that looked out over the side garden, where the last of the afternoon light was leaving the grass. On the music stand, someone had already placed a score, not the waltz she had brought with her, but another copy of the same piece, as though they had not entirely trusted her to arrive with the right music. Clara set her own copy beside it. She opened her case. She lifted the violin, rosined the bow, and sat down. She looked at the waltz. Then she looked at the window. The garden was very still. A single tree stood near the wall, and its leaves turned slowly in a small wind that Clara could not feel from inside the room. She watched the leaves for a moment. Then she brought the violin up, settled it under her chin, and began to play through the waltz from the beginning. It took just under 4 minutes. When she finished, she lowered the bow and sat with the quiet. The piece was fine. She had known it would be fine. Fine was not a word she had ever been able to make peace with, not when it came to music, but she had learned, or was still learning, that not every performance needed to carry everything. Some evenings called for a waltz. Some rooms called for wallpaper. That was the reality of working as a musician who was not yet famous enough to choose only the rooms that wanted more. She played through it a second time. Slower this time, paying more attention to each phrase. When she finished the second time, she set the bow across her knee and looked at the window again. The tree in the garden had stopped moving. The leaves were still now, and the light had shifted to that particular shade that comes in the hour before a summer evening fully settles, not dark, not golden, something between the two that doesn't have a proper name but that Clara had always thought of as the color of a thing waiting to be decided. She thought about Edna. She thought about the 7 years of lessons in that small room at the back of Edna's house, where the piano was slightly out of tune and the carpet was worn through in a circle around the bench, worn by decades of students shifting their weight as they played. She thought about the evening Edna had listened to her play for the better part of an hour without saying a single word, and then had said, very quietly, "You are holding back. I can hear it in every phrase. You play as though you are asking for permission. Stop asking. nobody worth listening to ever asked. Clara had been 20 years old when Edna said that. She had gone home that night and cried, not because the words had hurt, though they had, but because they were true, and she had known they were true, and she had not known until that moment that someone else could hear it. She had been trying ever since to stop asking. She was still trying. The sound of footsteps in the corridor outside the antechamber brought her back to the room. She lifted the violin again, positioned the bow, and waited. The footsteps passed without stopping, someone on their way to somewhere else. Clara exhaled. She played through the waltz one final time. This time she played it well, not brilliantly, not with everything she had, but cleanly, carefully, with attention and skill. It sounded like exactly what it was. A simple waltz, background music for a dinner, something that would sit in the room like wallpaper and do its job without asking anything of anyone. She lowered the bow. She looked at the two copies of the score on the music stand, hers, and the one that had already been there. Then she reached out and moved both of them carefully to the edge of the stand, leaving the center clear. She was not sure entirely why she did it. She told herself it was only to have the stand clear, that it meant nothing, that she was going to go out there and play the waltz and take her fee and go home and make tea and practice the next morning the same way she did every morning. She told herself that. But her hand, when she set the scores aside, was very steady, and she was breathing in the slow, deliberate way she only ever breathed before she was about to do something that she could not undo. She did not play anything else while she waited. She sat with the violin in her lap and her hands quiet, and the room around her filled with the sound of the dinner on the other side of the wall, voices and glass and silverware, and the small, constant music of people who believed they were the most important sound in any room they entered. She waited. Outside the window, the light finally made up its mind and went to evening. The garden went from that in-between color to a deep, soft gray, and the single tree stood very still against it, and not one leaf moved. She waited. She was ready. She had always been ready. That, in its own way, was the whole story, the long, patient, sometimes wearing readiness of a person who has spent their whole life preparing for a room that has not yet asked for what they have to give. That room was on the other side of the door. The dinner was in progress. The guests were comfortable and warm and expecting nothing more than background noise. She held her violin. She was very, very still. And then the door opened. Nobody had ever handed Clara Hinton anything. Not the scholarship to the City Conservatory, which she had earned by performing 2 hours of difficult repertoire in front of a panel of 5 judges who spent the first 40 minutes of her audition talking quietly among themselves. She had kept playing. She had played until the room went silent and the judges put down their pens. The scholarship had arrived in a letter 6 days later. She had read it standing at the kitchen table, the same posture, the same stillness she brought to everything that mattered to her. Not the 7 years with Edna Marsh, which had cost money she did not have and which she had paid for by playing background music at hotels, at civic functions, at birthday celebrations for people who glanced at her once and returned to their conversations. She had played at a wedding where the groom spent the entire ceremony looking past the bride. She had played at a retirement dinner where nobody in the room was listening. She had played at a gallery opening where someone set a drinks tray on her music stand because they thought it was a side table. She had lifted the tray, set it on the floor, straightened the stand, and kept playing. This was the particular education that no conservatory teaches and no scholarship covers. The education of being present in rooms that do not notice you, of caring about the work regardless of whether the work is cared about, of understanding that the quality of your playing has nothing to do with whether the people in the room are listening, and that the moment you begin playing for the room instead of for the music, you have already lost something that is very difficult to find again. Edna had told her this with words. Life had told her this with experience. The two lessons had reinforced each other until they were not really two lessons at all but one single, bone-deep understanding. Still, it had cost her. There had been a period when she was 22 when she had nearly stopped. Not dramatically, not in the way stories sometimes describe it, with a moment of crisis and a definitive decision and a clear before and after. It had been quieter than that. She had simply found herself, over the course of several months, playing less and less outside of her obligations, and finding the obligations themselves harder to meet, and sitting at her kitchen table in the evenings with the violin in its case across the room and no desire to open it. Her friend Miriam, who played the cello and who had known Clara since they were children at the same music school, had come by one evening and found her sitting at that table with a cup of cold tea. Miriam had not asked any questions. She had sat down across from Clara, wrapped both hands around her own cup and said, "You know what I think about sometimes? I think about that afternoon in the school practice room when you were 14 and you played that piece. You know the one, and I was walking past the door and I stopped because I thought the radio was on. I thought it was a recording. I opened the door because I couldn't believe there was a person in there. And there you were, just you. In that gray sweater you wore every single day, playing like the room was on fire." Clara had said, "I remember that day." Miriam had said, "I know you do. The room is still on fire, you just can't see it from the table." She had opened the violin case that night. She had played until past midnight. Miriam had sat on the sofa and listened without saying anything, and when Clara finally stopped, Miriam had poured them both a glass of wine and said, "There, that's what I mean." Clara had come back from that period changed in a way she could not entirely name, except that something had shifted in her relationship to the work. Something had deepened. She had stopped needing the people in the room to be listening. Not because she no longer wanted them to listen. She still wanted that deeply, in the way that every musician who is honest with herself wants to be heard, but because she had found a way to play that did not depend on it. A way to be fully in the music, even when no one else was. This was not peace. It was not resignation. It was closer to something Edna had described once as mature devotion. The devotion of a person who has moved past the first, urgent stage of wanting to be seen and arrived at the quieter, more durable stage of wanting to give. It was from that place that she played the hotel lobbies and the civic functions and the gallery openings. It was from that place that she had accepted Lord Fairfield's invitation. But there was something else, something underneath all of that, which she did not talk about often because talking about it made it feel smaller than it was. She had a piece. Not the waltz, not anything she had been asked to play. Something that lived in her hands and her chest, and the particular place in her mind where music went when it stopped being notes on a page and became something else, something physical, something she could feel in her ribs. She had first heard it at 19, played by a musician named Gerald Hart, who had come to the city for a single concert, and had taken the stage with the particular quiet confidence of a person who has nothing to prove and everything to give. She had sat in the third row. She had not moved for the entire performance. Afterward, she had stood in the long corridor outside the hall with her program in her hands, and she had looked at the name of the piece he had played, and she had committed it to memory, and she had spent the next 2 weeks finding a copy of the score, and the 2 years after that learning it. She was still learning it. It was the kind of piece that does not arrive all at once. It came in layers, each layer revealing the one beneath it, each month of practice opening a door she had not known was there. She thought perhaps she would be learning it for the rest of her life, in the way that certain things, certain friendships, certain landscapes, certain years of experience reveal themselves slowly and keep revealing themselves and never quite finish. She played it on the mornings when she was not obligated to play anything else. She played it when Miriam came over and they spent the afternoon playing together, running through pieces they loved without any particular purpose. She played it when she was happy. She played it when she was not. It did not care which she was. It held both. She had never played it in public. Not for lack of skill. She was good enough now, she knew that. 3 years of work had brought her to a level of understanding with the piece that she trusted. Not perfection. She did not believe in perfection as a goal. Edna had cured her of that early on, but real understanding. The understanding that comes from living with a piece long enough that it stops being music you play and becomes music you know. In the same way you know a person well enough to predict how they will react to any given thing. She had not played it in public because the right moment had not come. She was not entirely sure what the right moment meant. She had thought about it on and off over the years. She had imagined various scenarios: a concert hall, a late evening performance, a room of people who were genuinely there to listen. She had not imagined a nobleman's dinner. She had not imagined a room of well-dressed guests who expected a waltz. She had not imagined this. And yet, the day before the dinner, she had opened the violin case and played the piece from beginning to end. And when she finished, she had sat for a long time with the bow across her knee, and something had settled in her chest that she could not quite name. It felt like recognition. It felt like the particular awareness of a moment arriving, not dramatically, not with announcement, but the way important things often arrive, quietly, in the space between one breath and the next. She had packed the waltz score. She had also packed nothing else, because there was nothing else she needed to pack. Everything she needed was already inside her. On the morning of the dinner, she had practiced for 2 hours as usual, playing the piece she loved with the full attention and full commitment she always brought to it. She had played the waltz twice, cleanly, correctly. And then she had closed the case, made tea, and thought about what it meant to stop asking permission. Edna had said those words when Clara was 20. 6 years had passed. She had heard them many times since, in memory, in the particular way that the truest things you have been told stay audible long after the person who said them has gone quiet. Stop asking. Nobody worth listening to ever asked. She thought about the rooms she had played in over those 6 years. The hotel lobbies where nobody glanced up from their conversations. The gallery where someone set a tray on her music stand. The retirement dinner where the guest of honor fell asleep during the third piece. She had played through all of it. She had carried herself through all of it with exactly the quality Edna had most wanted her to have, the quality of not needing the room to validate the music. But there was a difference, she understood now, between not needing the room and accepting whatever the room decided to give. Between playing without approval and playing without ambition. Between the patience of a person who knows their moment will come and the quietness of a person who has stopped believing it will. She admitted this to herself on that morning, sitting at the kitchen table with her tea. She had been too patient. Not in the practice room. In life. In the decisions she made about which rooms to enter and what she allowed herself to play in them. The waltz was a fine piece. She would play it if that was what the evening asked for. She was not planning anything. She was not deciding anything. But she was thinking about Gerald Hart, standing on that stage when she was 19, with that particular quiet confidence, and the way he had played as though the piece was the only thing in the world that existed at that moment, and the way the room, full of people who had come with expectations, and with other conversations still humming in their heads, had gone absolutely still. Not because of the venue, not because of his credentials, because of the truth of the playing. That was what a room could not ignore, no matter how distracted it was, no matter how comfortable, no matter how certain it had been when the evening started that it already knew what it was going to hear. Clara finished her tea. She picked up her violin case. She caught the tram. She watched a child reach for the case with small, determined hands, and she smiled, and the child smiled back, and the city moved past the windows in its usual way, ordinary and alive, and she sat with the weight of the instrument against her leg, and the waltz score under her arm, and something she had been carrying for 6 years alive and quiet and patient in her chest. She did not know what was going to happen at the dinner. She thought she might be beginning to know. But she said nothing about it to anyone. She held it the way she held the best parts of herself, privately, carefully, with the particular kind of attention you give to something that is not yet ready to be touched by the world. The tram reached her stop. She stepped off, and the evening was warm, and the estate was a quarter-mile away, and she walked toward it without hurrying, because she had learned that the moments that matter do not arrive faster if you run toward them. They arrive when they are ready, and what you have to do is be ready too. She was ready. She had been ready for years. The antechamber was exactly the kind of room that was not meant to be noticed. It existed, as most antechambers do, for the purpose of keeping things and people out of the way until they were needed. The walls were bare. The single window, narrow and high, gave a view of the side garden that was pleasant without being interesting. The chair was wooden and upright, positioned beside the music stand with the practical efficiency of someone who had placed chairs beside music stands many times before and had no opinions about comfort. There was no rug. There was no art. There was a small hook on the wall near the door where Clara had hung her coat, and the hook was the most personal thing in the room. She had been in rooms like this many times. She knew them well, not their individual details, which were largely interchangeable, but their feeling. The feeling of waiting in a space that has been designed for waiting, in a house that has been designed for other things. The feeling of being somewhere between places, between the outside world and the room you have been called toward. The in-between feeling. She had spent a great deal of her working life in in-between places. What she had learned over the years was how to use the waiting. Lesser musicians, not less talented but less experienced in the particular discipline of the hired player, found the waiting difficult. She had spoken with enough of them to know this. The sitting with nothing to do, the sound of other people's enjoyment on the other side of the wall, the awareness of being auxiliary, present but not yet necessary. Some of them dealt with it by playing scales, keeping the fingers warm. Some of them read. One violinist she knew brought a small book of crossword puzzles specifically for waiting rooms, and she thought there was something admirable about that, the honest acknowledgement that waiting was part of the job and deserved its own preparation. Clara used the waiting to listen. Not to anything in particular and not actively, not the way a person listens when they are trying to gather information. She listened the way an instrument listens, openly, without agenda, receiving whatever was there. From the antechamber she could hear the dinner party in progress on the other side of the wall. The guests had arrived sometime in the past hour. She could track the evening's progress by sound. There had been the bright, scattered noise of people coming together, greetings, movement, chairs being settled, the first round of drinks poured. Then a lower, warmer sound as conversations found their rhythms. Now, from what she could hear, the guests were settled and comfortable. The occasional rise and fall of laughter. The steady, unbroken tone of people who knew each other well enough to be at ease. She did not strain to hear words. She wasn't interested in words. She was interested in the quality of the sound, the way a room full of people makes a sound that is greater than any individual voice in it, a kind of collective tone that tells you, if you are listening to it properly, something about the emotional temperature of the gathering. The room was warm. Not physically, she could not feel the temperature through the wall, but in the way she was hearing it. These were people who felt safe, who felt at home, who had walked through the doors of this estate that evening expecting exactly what was happening and expecting it to continue happening smoothly, pleasantly, according to the shape that evenings like this one were supposed to take. A waltz was the right music for this room. She knew that. A waltz fit the temperature of the gathering the way the right key fits a lock, not dramatically, not with any particular effort, just a smooth and accurate match. She could hear the room that the waltz had been chosen for, and it was a good choice, and whoever had made it with a reasonable understanding of what the evening required. She played through the waltz in her head, not on the violin. She could do this as easily as some people could replay a conversation or recall a face. She could replay music with perfect internal accuracy, hear every note in her mind as clearly as if the bow were moving. She ran through the waltz from beginning to end. 3 minutes, 40 seconds. Quiet, graceful, pleasantly melodic. The kind of music that would settle itself over the evening like a warm cloth, noticed, perhaps, on the level of comfort, but not directly, not consciously, not the way music that demands something of you is noticed. She finished the internal run-through and sat with her hands in her lap. Then, without quite deciding to, she began to run through the other piece. This was different. This was not quiet. Even in her mind, even without the violin, the piece moved through her with that particular quality she had never been able to describe accurately to anyone who hadn't felt it. It wasn't loud, exactly. It wasn't aggressive. It was honest in a way that made everything around it feel slightly less honest by comparison, the way a clear day makes you notice that most days are not quite so clear. She stopped herself before she got to the second movement. She looked at the music stand. Both copies of the waltz were there, the one she had brought and the one they had left for her. They sat side by side, very correct, very neatly placed. Someone had taken care with that. The music stand was positioned at exactly the right height. The scores were placed squarely. A small glass of water had been set on the chair's right arm for her, though she could not recall anyone having mentioned it when she sat down. Small, professional details. This was a household that had hosted musicians before and knew how it was done. She appreciated that. She noted it the way she noted all small things, with genuine attention, without making too much of it. She looked at the glass of water, then at the scores, then at the clear space on the music stand above them. The clear space was about a foot wide, very simple, just the surface of the stand with nothing on it. She was not thinking about anything in particular when she reached out and moved the scores slightly to one side, leaving more of that clear space available. She did not acknowledge to herself why she had done it. She simply did it, and then she settled back in the chair, and she picked up the violin, and she began to play the waltz. She played it well. Of course she played it well. She played the waltz the way she played everything, with full attention, with real skill, with care for each phrase and each turn of melody. This was not a quality she reserved for important performances. She had learned from Edna and from the longer education of working life that the quality of attention you bring to small things determines the quality of attention you can bring to large ones. You could not switch it on and off. You either had it or you didn't, and the only way to have it was to practice it always. The waltz took 3 minutes and 40 seconds, just as she had timed it in her head. When she finished, she held the bow still for a moment, letting the final note die naturally. Then she lowered it and sat. Through the wall, the dinner continued, a sharp burst of laughter quickly subsiding, the sound of a chair moving, someone speaking at length in a deeper register, someone else's brief response. She played the waltz a second time. She was aware, during this second playthrough, of a very particular quality of consciousness that she recognized from other moments, not many, but enough that she knew the shape of it. It was the awareness that comes when you are very close to a decision that you are not yet making openly. The decision exists, but you have not yet looked at it directly. It lives in the peripheral vision of the mind, and you can feel it there. And if you turn toward it too quickly or too deliberately, it may startle and disappear. So you keep it in the periphery, you let it be. She played the waltz, she played it correctly, she played it with skill. The peripheral thing stayed where it was. When she finished the second run-through, she set the bow across her knee and looked at the window. The light outside had gone fully to evening now. The garden was that deep, soft gray she had noticed earlier, and the single tree stood against it. Still, patient, very much in the manner of things that are simply there, not requesting anything, not arranging themselves for observation, simply occupying their space. She thought about what Miriam had said, that evening when Clara had been sitting at the kitchen table with cold tea. The room is still on fire, you just can't see it from the table. She thought about what Edna had said, that night past midnight when neither of them had noticed the time going. The music you are meant to play is not always the music you are asked to play. She thought about Gerald Hart, on stage when she was 19, with that quiet confidence that did not perform itself but simply existed. The way the room had gone still. Not because the room had been told to go still, because the music had been true, and true things, when they arrive in a room that has briefly stopped filling itself with noise, produce exactly that response. Stillness. The involuntary, honest stillness of people who have stopped performing their own comfort and started actually being present. The dinner on the other side of the wall continued. Clara looked at the music stand, at the scores, at the clear space. She placed the bow on the chair beside her. She reached out and took both copies of the waltz, hers and the one they had left, and she moved them together to the far edge of the stand. Not off the stand entirely, just to the edge, still there, still available. She was not deciding anything. She told herself this quietly and clearly, the way you speak to the part of yourself that is afraid of consequences. She was simply clearing the stand. She picked up the bow again. She lifted the violin. She sat in the straight-back chair in the small, bare, careful antechamber, with both copies of the waltz at the edge of the stand and the center clear, and she brought the instrument to her chin and she breathed. Once, slowly, the way she only breathed before something she could not undo. And then she began to play. Not the waltz. What came out of the violin in that small room was not the waltz. It was not quiet. It was not wallpaper. It was the piece she had been carrying for 3 years, the piece she had first heard played by a man with that particular quiet confidence, and it filled the antechamber immediately and completely, the way light fills a room the moment you open the curtains, not growing gradually, not arriving in stages, but all at once, total and immediate. She stopped. She lowered the bow. She sat very still. Outside the wall, the dinner continued. Nothing had changed on the other side. Nobody had heard. The first 4 bars of a private piece, played by a musician in a waiting room. She had been testing something. She had not known that was what she was doing until she heard the sound of it in the room, the sound of the other piece, the real piece, playing in the air of a room that was connected to the room she was about to walk into. It fit the air. Not the room, the air. She could feel the difference and she could not explain it, and she did not try to. She set the bow down again. She looked at the waltz scores on the edge of the stand. Then footsteps came to the door. A knock. The door opened. The secretary, narrow-shouldered, brisk, carrying a small notebook, leaned in. "We're ready for you," he said. Clara looked at him. She looked at the scores. She looked at the clear center of the music stand. She stood, she picked up the violin. She adjusted her grip on the bow. "Thank you," she said. She walked to the door. She did not take the waltz scores. She left them on the edge of the stand, both copies, precisely where she had placed them. She walked into the corridor, and the secretary fell into step ahead of her, and he led her toward the dining room, and the sound of the dinner grew louder with each step, closer and warmer and more certain of itself. And Clara walked toward it with the violin under her arm and the bow in her hand, and something settled in her chest that was not calm exactly, but was in that neighborhood, the particular steadiness that comes not from having no fear, but from having decided that the fear is no longer the most important thing in the room. She had left the waltz behind. She had not made a decision. And yet, she walked forward. The door to the dining room was just ahead. The secretary reached for the handle. Light spilled out from under it, warm, rich light, the light of a room that believed in itself. He opened the door. The dining room was longer than she had expected. The table ran nearly the full length of it, a dark, polished surface set with crystal and silver that caught the light from 2 rows of candles burning in holders down the center. The room had high ceilings and tall windows along one wall, currently dressed in heavy curtains that had been drawn against the evening. The other wall held paintings in gilded frames, landscapes mostly, the kind of paintings that announce prosperity rather than taste. The floor was pale wood, polished to the same degree as the table, so that the whole room gave the impression of a place where surfaces were considered very important. There were 12 people at the table. Clara counted them in the first 3 seconds. A habit, not a calculation, the same instinct that told her how many strings were in an orchestra before anyone had played a note. 12 people, 8 men, 4 women. They were dressed for the evening in the manner of people who dress for evenings with a certain ease, as though the clothes had simply arrived on their bodies by agreement. The candles threw warm light across the table and across the faces, and the faces were animated, mid-conversation, mid-laughter, mid-sentence when the door opened. Several of them glanced up. Not all. 2 kept talking. 1 man at the far end of the table turned to look and then turned back. 3 women near the center looked at her with the brief, assessing look of people who have just been joined by someone they did not invite and are determining whether this matters. It did not matter to any of them. Clara was the musician. She was there to play. The glances were not unfriendly, but they were not interested either. They registered her presence and moved on. Lord Fairfield sat at the head of the table. She knew him immediately, not because she had ever seen him before, but because the room arranged itself around him in the way rooms arrange themselves around the person who owns them. He was perhaps 55, broad-shouldered, a face that had once been handsome and had now arrived at something more interesting than handsome, a face that had lived in it. He held a glass of wine by the stem and was listening to the man on his left with the full attention of someone who had either been raised to make people feel heard or had learned it. He did not look at Clara when she entered. The secretary guided her to the far right corner of the room, where a small space had been cleared beside a bookcase. There was no elevated position, no particular spot of prominence, just a corner, out of the main sight lines, positioned so that her playing would distribute through the room without coming from any one clear direction. Background music placed correctly is directional only insofar as it comes from everywhere and nowhere at once. She understood this. She did not feel anything in particular about it. She set her violin case on the floor by the bookcase, straightened, and looked at the music stand that had been placed for her. It was there. No scores on it. She had brought the waltz and left it in the antechamber, and whoever had set the stand had apparently assumed she would bring her own music. A small error that was entirely her own making. The secretary leaned in. "Ready when you are," he said, low, under the conversation. Then he moved away toward his position near the door. Clara lifted the violin from under her arm. She brought it to her shoulder, set it beneath her chin. She adjusted her grip on the bow. She drew herself up to the height she always stood at when she was about to play, not stiff, not performance posture, but the natural height of a person who is not making herself small. She looked at the room. The conversations continued. The candles burned. A woman near the center of the table said something that made the man beside her lean back and laugh, and the sound of the laugh was easy and genuine. Someone passed a dish of something around the table. Lord Fairfield took a sip of wine and set the glass down with the precise care of a person who is listening to something and doesn't want the sound of glass on wood to interrupt it. Clara raised the bow. She looked at the empty music stand, and she felt it not as a dramatic sensation, not as something she could easily describe, but as the simple awareness of a moment in which she knew, without any remaining doubt, what she was about to do. The knowledge had been building in her for days, perhaps for years, in the way that some decisions build not as decisions at all, but as a slow accumulation of readiness. And then one day the readiness is simply complete, and what looked like a choice reveals itself to have been an arrival. She touched the bow to the strings. She played the first note of the waltz. It was a clear note, properly placed, the first note of a well-written opening. It entered the room at the level she intended, present but soft, a sound that would touch the edges of the conversations without breaking them. The waltz began here with a gentle, rising phrase. She played it. She played the second note and the third. She played 8 bars. 8 bars of the waltz, exactly as written, exactly as she had practiced it. They sounded correct. They sounded appropriate. They sounded like what they were, the beginning of a pleasant piece of background music in a room full of people who were not listening. And then she stopped. Not visibly. She did not lower the bow dramatically. She did not stop in the way that would have drawn attention. She moved from the 8th bar of the waltz, which ended on a long-held note, into a beat of silence that belonged naturally to the phrasing. And in that beat of silence she made the only real decision of the evening. Not a dramatic decision, not a terrifying one, just a decision. The kind of decision that, once made, does not feel like a turning point but simply like the moment when you stop standing still. The held note ended, the natural beat of silence after it arrived. And Clara played the first phrase of the other piece. It came out of the violin the way it always came, cleanly, directly, with that immediate quality of something that is not arriving but has simply always been there, waiting to be sounded. The phrase was 8 bars long and covered a range that the waltz had not touched. It climbed. It moved through something that was not ornamentation and not drama, but was, very simply, truth. The truth of a piece that had been written by someone who had felt something real and had found a way to put it directly into sound. No one at the table reacted. Not immediately. She played through the first phrase into the second. The second phrase was where the piece began to reveal what it was, not gently, not quietly, but not loudly either. It revealed itself the way certain truths reveal themselves, not with announcement but with presence. The kind of presence that makes a room slowly aware that something has changed, though they cannot yet say what. A woman at the near end of the table, dark-haired, somewhere in her 40s, who had been speaking to the man beside her, paused mid-sentence. She did not look toward Clara. She paused, held the pause for a beat longer than a breath, and then resumed the sentence. Clara watched this from the corner of her eye. She kept playing. The second phrase moved into the third. Here the piece opened outward. The melody spread across a wider range, climbed and fell and climbed again, and the bow moved through it with a pressure and speed that the waltz had never called for, drawing a sound from the instrument that was larger and warmer, and there was no better word, more alive than the sound the first 8 bars had produced. At the center of the table, one of the men had stopped speaking. He had not made a show of stopping. His sentence had simply run down, the way sentences do when a person's attention has been pulled elsewhere, and he was now sitting with his glass raised halfway to his mouth and not drinking from it. Clara noticed this. She noticed everything. She kept playing. The fourth phrase. This was where the piece, in her 3 years of working through it, had consistently done what she could only describe as opening a door, not metaphorically, practically. There was a specific moment in the fourth phrase where the music moved through a particular harmonic shift, not unusual in isolation, but placed where it was placed, preceded by what had preceded it. It produced an effect that she had felt the first time she heard Gerald Hart play it at 19, and that she still felt now, every time, without fail. She felt it. The bow moved through it. The sound of it moved through the room. A chair shifted, not dragged, not loudly, but the small adjustment of a person who has sat forward slightly without deciding to. Another chair, then another. Lord Fairfield was still. He had been still since approximately the second phrase, and his stillness was different from the stillness of the people around him. Not the stillness of a person who has been interrupted mid-thought, but the stillness of a person who has been listening for some time, and who is now listening with the full and deliberate investment of someone who has just realized that what they are hearing deserves it. He had not looked at her yet. Clara moved through the fourth phrase and into the fifth. The fifth was long. It carried the emotional weight of everything that had come before it, and it carried it with a kind of steadiness that she found, every time, to be the most difficult part of the piece, not technically, but in the sense of being fully present inside the music's truth without distancing yourself from it, without performing it from the outside. the difference between playing a phrase and living inside it. She had been practicing that difference for 3 years. She lived inside it now. The fifth phrase moved through the room, and the room moved with it. Or rather, the room began to stop moving, stopped being a room of conversations and motion and comfortable certainty, and began, phrase by phrase and note by note, to become something else. Something that was still itself, still a dining room with candles and crystal and 12 people and high ceilings, but that had been, very quietly, very completely, rearranged around what was happening in the corner beside the bookcase. The woman who had paused mid-sentence had not resumed it. The man with his glass raised had set it down. The secretary by the door had taken 2 steps forward and then stopped and was standing with his notepad against his chest, not writing anything. And Lord Fairfield turned and looked at Clara. She saw him turn. She did not look back directly, but she felt the turn, and she felt the quality of the look, which was not the look of a man assessing a situation. It was the look of a man who has been reached by something he did not expect to reach him, and who is adjusting his understanding of the evening accordingly. Clara played. Her bow moved. Her fingers placed and lifted and placed again with the precision and automaticity of 22 years, and underneath all of the technique, underneath the muscle memory and the trained instinct, was the thing that technique exists to serve and could not itself produce, the thing that was simply and entirely her, the particular quality of her attention and her feeling and her 26 years of being alive in the world and finding the world worth feeling. It was in the music. It had always been in the music. She was simply, at last, playing it in a room that was being asked to hear it. She moved through the fifth phrase. She moved into the sixth. The room was very quiet. Not the quiet of people who have been told to be quiet. The other kind. The kind that is not obedience but its own choice. The kind of quiet that a room makes for itself when something has arrived in it that it does not want to interrupt. Outside the drawn curtains, the city continued. Trams and voices and the ordinary movement of an evening. In here, none of that existed. In here there was only the long dining table, and the candles burning steadily, and 12 people who had stopped being the most important sound in the room, and a young woman in a corner who had walked in carrying a waltz she had left behind. She kept playing. The piece had 7 movements. She had not planned to play all of them. She had not planned anything if she was being precise about it. What had begun in those 8 bars of the waltz that she had played and then moved away from had not been a plan. It had been a breath. It had been the breath she took at the end of the 8th bar, in the natural silence of the phrasing, and then the simple fact of what came next, the first phrase of the other piece, arriving not as a decision, but as the only thing her hands knew how to do after that particular breath. She was now deep inside the second movement. The second movement of this piece was the quietest of the 7. It was not gentle in the way the waltz was gentle. It was quiet in the way a person is quiet when they are about to say something important. The silence around the notes was as deliberate as the notes themselves. Every phrase held its shape and then released into a pause that was not empty, that was loaded with whatever the phrase had just placed in the room. She had once described this movement to Miriam as the part that teaches you how to wait. Miriam had said, teaches who to wait, and Clara had said, everyone, and Miriam had said, that's a lot of responsibility for a piece of music, and Clara had said, it's up to the music. The 12 people at the table were waiting. This was not how people at a dinner party usually waited. Usually, in the gap between one thing and another at a dinner table, people fill the gap. They reach for their glass. They lean toward the person beside them. They adjust something on the tablecloth. They fill the gap with the small, constant business of being present at a social occasion and knowing that their presence is required and visible. Nobody was filling the gap now. A man at the center of the table, heavyset, perhaps 60, with a gray mustache that he had been tugging at periodically throughout the dinner, had both hands flat on the table and was looking at them. Not at Clara, at his own hands, as though the music had given him somewhere private to be. A woman near the far end had her eyes closed. Clara noticed. She always noticed. Her eyes moved across the room in the natural, quiet way of a musician who has learned to read a room while playing, whose attention can be fully in the music and fully in the room at the same time, because the two things are not separate. Lord Fairfield was watching her. She was aware of this. He had turned fully in his chair. The head of the table gave him room to do this without disturbing anyone, and he was watching her with an expression she would have struggled to describe precisely. Not surprise, though there was something of that in it. Not pleasure, though there was something of that too. Something more serious than either. Something that took stock. She did not look at him directly. You did not look at the room when you were playing. You were in the room and of the room and giving the room everything you had, but you did not look. Looking was a different kind of attention from playing, and she could not afford to split the one. The second movement ended. Not with a large sound, with a very small one. The last note alone at the end of a long phrase was the quietest thing she had played all evening. She held the bow on the string for a breath after it, feeling the note's vibration decay, and then she lifted it. A pause. In a concert hall, this would be the moment when a thoughtless audience member coughed or shifted, and she had always thought there was something almost funny about that, the human inability to hold stillness even when stillness was clearly the thing being called for. Here, no one moved, no one coughed, no one shifted. 12 people at a dining table, in a room with high ceilings and candles and silver, held perfectly still. She moved the bow to the strings for the third movement. The third movement was where the piece changed its nature. The first two movements had been, she thought of them as an opening, an invitation, though not a gentle one. The third movement was something different. It was, as Gerald Hart had described it in an interview she had read years later, the part of the piece where the music stops being polite about what it is. She had read that interview many times. She had memorized parts of it. She thought about those words now, stops being polite about what it is, as her bow moved into the first phrase of the third, and the sound that came out was wider and more urgent than anything she had played so far. It was not loud. She had made a mistake early in her years of working with this piece, of thinking that honest meant loud, that the third movement's intensity required a certain volume. It did not. It required presence. Full, unguarded, undiluted presence. The kind you produce not by pushing more sound into the room but by holding nothing back from the sound you were producing. The difference was everything. She held nothing back. The third phrase of the third movement contained what her teacher Edna had once described, in a context that had nothing to do with this piece, but that Clara had immediately applied to it, as the musical equivalent of a person finally saying what they actually mean. Edna had been talking about something else entirely when she said it, a letter or a conversation. Clara no longer remembered the specifics, but the description had lodged in her mind and stayed there because it was true. There was a phrase in the third movement that felt like that, like finally saying the actual thing. She played it. The man with the gray mustache lifted his hands from the table and brought them together in front of his mouth, the way a person sometimes does when they are trying to hold something in. He was not aware that he had done it. The woman with her eyes closed pressed 2 fingers lightly against the side of her throat, not dramatically, not as a gesture, just the natural movement of a hand that has gone somewhere without permission. Lord Fairfield had not moved. He had not taken his eyes from Clara. His glass of wine sat on the table beside him, and the wine in it had not been touched since she had stopped playing the waltz. The secretary was no longer by the door. At some point in the second or third movement, he had taken 2 more steps into the room, and now he was standing between 2 of the chairs along the wall, slightly displaced from his post, and his notepad was at his side, and he was not taking notes. Clara moved through the third movement. She moved through it the way she moved through all the hardest parts of the hardest things she had ever done, not by pushing through them but by being fully in them, fully in each moment of them, without looking ahead to where they ended or behind to where they had begun. The third movement was long and it asked a great deal, and she gave everything it asked, and then found that there was more to give, which was always the thing about giving everything. There was always more. The fourth movement followed without a break. She had never played the fourth movement anywhere but her own room. The piece, in her experience of it, had 4 movements she had fully worked through and 3 that she was still inside, still in the process of understanding. She had played the fourth movement carefully, many times in the privacy of her apartment, feeling her way through it the way you feel your way through a room in the dark, deliberately, with attention, willing to be surprised. She had not known, until this moment, if she could play it in front of people. She could. The fourth movement was the most personal of the 7. It was the movement that, in her understanding of the piece, said the thing that the whole piece had been working toward, not the final thing, not the resolution, but the central truth that everything before and after it orbited. She had always thought of it as the movement that knew the most about being human, about the particular experience of having a life that is larger on the inside than it appears from the outside, about the experience of carrying something real through rooms that are not yet ready to receive it. She thought about this as she played it, not in words. She never thought in words while she played, but in that other kind of thinking, the kind that happens in the body and in the breath and in the particular quality of the attention you bring to each note as it arrives. The woman who had been mid-sentence in the second phrase had still not resumed it. Her dinner companion had turned slightly away from her and toward the room, the way a person turns when they are trying to see the source of a sound more clearly. 3 conversations had stopped entirely. The table had been lively with sound when Clara entered the room, a dozen voices, the ease of well-acquainted people, the music of an evening that expects itself to be pleasant. Now the table was silent, not because anyone had decided to be silent, because the music had made silence the only honest response. She moved through the fourth movement. The candles burned. One of them near the center of the table had begun to gutter slightly in some small drift of air, and it threw a faint, shifting light across the silver beside it. She watched this from the corner of her eye while her hands did the work they knew how to do. The light moved. The silver caught it. The music moved through the room. She finished the fourth movement. The pause afterward was different from the pause after the second, longer, fuller, a pause with more inside it. She stood in it for 3 full beats. Then she moved into the fifth. The fifth movement was where the piece became something that she had struggled for a long time to find a word for. She had tried several, demanding, fierce, expansive. None of them quite reached it. Gerald Hart had called it in the same interview the movement that asks everything. She thought that was closer. She had not been sure, when she began playing in this room, that she would reach the fifth movement. She had thought she might play 1 or 2 movements and stop, because the room had not been listening, or because the piece had not opened the way it sometimes didn't open when the conditions were wrong, or simply because she had not been able to find the courage to keep going past the place where stopping was still socially acceptable. But the room was listening. The piece had opened, and the particular quality of steadiness in her chest that she had felt since leaving the antechamber had not diminished. It had, if anything, increased, the way a fire increases when air reaches it, not dramatically, not with great visible change, but with a deepening of itself. She played the fifth movement. This was the one that took everything, not in the sense of difficulty, though it was difficult, technically demanding in ways that required the full use of everything she had learned in 22 years, in the sense that it could not be played halfway. You were either fully in it or it exposed you, the way all honest things expose you if you try to hold something back while delivering them. She was fully in it. The bow moved, her fingers moved, the sound moved through the room. The man who had been looking at his hands was now looking at Clara with an expression that she could not have described, and that he probably could not have described either. Lord Fairfield had shifted in his chair, not away but forward. Slightly. The way a person shifts when they have moved, without deciding to, closer to something they need to be closer to. The fifth movement built. It asked everything, and then it asked more. It climbed to a place that Clara had reached many times in private, and that she was reaching now here in this room, in front of these 12 people who had walked in expecting dinner and conversation and a waltz. She reached it. She stayed in it. She played through it with everything she had, and the room held the kind of silence that is not the absence of sound, but the presence of something so much more than sound that everything else, the candles, the silver, the drawn curtains, the city beyond them, fell away from the edges of what was real. And then the fifth movement ended. Not gradually, on a single, clear, full note that she held for 3 full beats before lifting the bow. Silence. Complete and total. Nobody breathed. The 6th second of that silence was when something shifted in the room. Not a sound, not a movement, something below those things, something in the temperature of the air or the quality of the collective awareness of 12 people who had been brought, without any of them quite knowing when it had happened, from the comfortable surface of their evening down to somewhere much closer to the truth of themselves. Clara felt it. She always felt the room's shifts before they became visible. It was the same instinct that told her, in an orchestra. When the ensemble was about to lose the beat, not the beat dropping, but the moment just before, the tiny loosening of a shared internal pulse. She felt this room the way she felt an ensemble, as a single thing made of many parts with its own unified temperature, its own collective breath. The room had exhaled. Not physically, not yet, that would come, but in the way that a room exhales when something that has been held in it for a long time is finally allowed to move. She stood in that silence for 3 more beats. Then she moved the bow to the strings and began the 6th movement. The 6th was something she had thought of privately as the movement that admits what the 5th movement cost. If the 5th was the peak, the place of greatest height and demand, the 6th was the view from slightly after the peak, still high, still real, but with the particular quality of something that has just spent itself fully and is now breathing differently. Not diminished. Changed. She had been working with the 6th movement for over a year now. It was harder than the 5th in some ways, not technically but emotionally, because it required a different quality of presence. The 5th had required everything she had. The 6th required something she was still learning to access, a kind of openness on the other side of everything. The willingness to keep being present after you have spent yourself. The willingness to stay in the room after the most important thing has already happened, and to find that there is still something real there. She moved through the opening phrase. The room around her had a different quality now than it had had when she entered. The 12 people at the table were still in their chairs, still arranged around the dark, polished wood and the silver and the candles. None of that had changed, but the people inside those positions had changed. They were not the people they had been when she walked in carrying a violin and went to stand in the corner beside the bookcase. Those people had been at ease. These people were present in a different and more demanding way. The woman near the far end whose eyes had been closed during the 5th movement had opened them. She was looking at the candle flame nearest to her, not at Clara, not at anyone at the table, but at the flame. Her expression was the expression of a person who has just been reminded of something they had not thought about in a long time. The man with the gray mustache had let his hands drop from in front of his face. He was now holding his wine glass loosely in both hands, not drinking, rolling it slightly between his palms. The wine moved in the glass. He watched it move. Clara played the 6th movement's 2nd phrase. This was where the piece did the thing that had surprised her the most when she first learned it, and still surprised her now. Instead of continuing the emotional descent from the 5th's height, it turned. Not back up exactly, but sideways. Into something that was neither the fullness of the 5th nor a lessening of it, but a third thing that she did not have words for and had never tried to put into words, because it was the kind of thing that words were not designed to reach. This was why it was a piece of music. This was why music existed. Lord Fairfield was still watching her. He had been watching her since midway through the third movement, when she had seen him turn, and he had not looked away since. She knew this without looking directly at him. She was aware of his attention the way you are aware of light, not by looking at the source, but by the quality of illumination around you. His attention had a weight and a steadiness that she had felt throughout the longer movements, and it was in the room now with the same quality. He had said nothing. He had made no signal, no gesture. He had simply watched, with the particular attentiveness of someone who has encountered something they did not expect, and has decided that the most appropriate response is to encounter it fully. She had played for people like this before, not often, but enough to recognize the quality. It was rare. It was the response she had been trying to earn, had been playing toward, in every room she had walked into since she was 19 years old. She played the third phrase of the sixth movement. The secretary had returned, at some point in the fifth movement, to his position near the door. She had not noticed the return, but she was aware of it now. He was there again, back in his place, his notepad pressed to his chest. She had seen him take those steps into the room during the third movement, drawn forward without deciding to move, and then he had returned to his post the way people return to the position that is assigned to them when they realize they have drifted. But he had not opened the door. He had not done anything to stop or interrupt. He had simply repositioned himself and continued to listen. Clara moved through the sixth movement's fourth phrase, which was the last long phrase before the final section. This phrase was the one she loved most in the entire piece, for reasons she had never entirely articulated even to herself. It did something that she thought of as finishing a sentence that had been begun a very long time ago. Not in the piece, in her. As though some sentence in her experience of being alive had been unfinished for as long as she could remember, and this particular sequence of notes, in this particular order, completed it. She played it now with the same feeling of completion that she always played it with, and it occurred to her, as it moved through the room and through the people in the room and through the candle light and the silence, that this might be the only time she played it here, in this place, in front of these people. That tomorrow she would wake in her apartment and make tea and practice as she always did, and this evening would be one of the evenings she remembered. One of the evenings she would think about when she needed to remember what the work was for. The fourth phrase ended. She moved into the sixth movement's final section. The final section was brief, 8 bars. It brought the sixth movement to a close that was neither resolution nor continuation, but something she thought of as a door left open, not unfinished, not unresolved, but deliberately, consciously open onto what came next, which in this piece was the seventh and final movement, and which in any given performance was whatever the room, and the player, and the particular quality of the air and the attention and the evening brought to the threshold. She reached the final bar of the sixth movement. She played it. She held the last note, longer than the score indicated, and she had always played it longer than indicated, because the score's marking felt too brief for what the note needed to accomplish, and this was one of the places where the piece lived in her hands rather than on the page. She held it until it was finished, until the bow had drawn everything from it that was there to draw. Then she lifted the bow. Silence. A different silence from the one after the fifth. The fifth silence had been the silence of people who have been overwhelmed and are not yet ready to speak. This silence was the silence of people who are listening for what comes next, a silence that is not an ending but an intake of breath. She stood in it. One of the candles near the center of the table had gone out quietly, without drama, while she was playing the fourth phrase. The wax had burned down and the flame had simply ceased, and now there was a small curl of smoke rising from the wick. Nobody had noticed. The table was still illuminated by the remaining candles, but there was one fewer source of light than there had been, and the change was slight but real, and the smoke from the extinguished candle drifted upward in a thin line and then dispersed. Clara was aware of this. She was aware of everything in the room. She had been aware of everything in the room for the entirety of the performance, in that doubled quality of attention that allowed her to be fully in the music and fully in the space simultaneously. She had noticed the man with the mustache and his wine glass. She had noticed the woman with her eyes closed. She had noticed Lord Fairfield's unbroken attention, and the secretary's 2 steps forward and his return to the door and the gone-out candle. She had noticed all of it, and she had kept playing. And now she stood in the silence after the 6th movement with all of that noticing still alive in her, and the 7th movement waiting. The 7th movement was the one she had not fully made her own. She had played it in private many times. She knew it thoroughly, every phrase, every dynamic, every place where the tempo breathed, and every place where it drove. She knew it the way you know a road you have walked many times. Every turn familiar, every surface underfoot understood. But she had not yet played it the way she had played the others tonight. She had not yet played it from inside it. She was going to play it from inside it. Not because she had decided this. She had decided nothing. She had been deciding nothing all evening, which was perhaps the most important thing, that none of this had been decided. It had simply been what happened when she stopped asking permission, when she let what was in her hands go where it needed to go without interposing the question of whether it was allowed. She raised the bow. The room held its breath, not metaphorically. She could feel the collective inhalation, 12 people, and a secretary who had drawn breath slightly, simultaneously, in the natural anticipation of what comes after a long silence in music, the body's involuntary preparation for sound. She set the bow to the strings. She played the 7th movement. It opened not quietly but at full presence, immediately, without the establishing phrases of the earlier movements. The 7th began as though it had been in progress for some time, and she was simply now joining it, the way you join a river that has been running before you arrived and will continue after you have left. She played it at full commitment, and the room, which had already been rearranged by everything that had come before, received it with the totality it deserved. The 7th movement was the most demanding, not in the way that word is usually applied to music, not technically, not in tempo or range or finger work, though it asked for all of those. It was demanding in the way that honest final things are always demanding, in the way that saying the truest thing you have ever said is demanding, not because you have to find the words but because you have to be willing to have said them. She was willing. She had been willing since she played the first note of the first phrase in this room. She had been willing since she walked out of the antechamber without the waltz scores. She had been willing, she understood now, for years, held in readiness by the patience she had built in all those in-between rooms, all those evenings in corners beside bookcases, all those years of playing the music she was asked to play while carrying the music she meant to play, until at last the 2 things had arrived in the same room at the same moment, and she had simply let them meet. The 7th movement built. It built the way a life builds, not through a single moment of decision, but through the accumulation of all the moments that preceded it, each one small, each one real, until the weight of them together became something that could not be mistaken for anything less than what it was. She played. The room was absolutely still. The candles burned. And somewhere in the 7th movement, in a phrase near the end that she had always thought of as the piece's true last word, Clara Hinton stopped thinking about any of it, stopped noticing the room, stopped being aware of the 12 people or the candles or Lord Fairfield's steady gaze or the secretary by the door. She stopped being in the room entirely, in the sense of being aware of herself being in it. She was only in the music, which was, as Edna had always said, the only place worth being. The final phrase of the 7th movement was 16 bars long. She had counted them the first time she learned it, the way you count the steps of a staircase when you are new to a building, Not because you need the number, but because you are trying to understand the shape of what you are navigating. 16 bars. She had counted them, and then she had stopped counting them, because the number stopped mattering once the phrase became known to her. Once she could feel its length from inside it the way you feel the length of a room you know well. She was inside those 16 bars now. The piece had been building toward this phrase for its entire length. Not the way a piece builds toward a dramatic finale, not in the popular sense of the biggest sound saved for the end. It built toward this phrase the way a good conversation builds toward its truest moment, quietly, gradually, with each previous movement contributing something necessary to the place where you now were, so that when you arrived, the arrival felt both inevitable and new. She played through bar 9. The phrase was not loud here. It was full. There was a difference, and she had learned it from Edna during her 3rd year of lessons, when Edna had listened to her play a passage and had said, very gently, "You are making it big because you think that is what it requires. But listen, big is a question of volume. Full is a question of presence. Make it full." Full was what she gave it now. Bar 11, bar 12. The room around her was in a state she had felt only a handful of times in her life, a state in which the boundary between the music and the people listening to it had become permeable, not dissolved. The music was still the music, and the people were still themselves. But the border between them, that border which usually makes music a thing that happens to an audience, had thinned. The music was moving through them rather than arriving at them. She could feel this. It was not imagined. It was a quality of the room's silence, the quality of a silence that is not empty but is very full of the experience of people who are being moved and who have stopped trying to not be moved. Bar 13, 14. A woman at the table, one of the 4, had put her hand briefly over her mouth and then removed it and looked at the table in front of her. The man with the gray mustache was still, entirely still, in a way that large men sometimes are when they are feeling something they have no framework for, not uncomfortable, but held, as though the feeling had placed its hands on his shoulders and asked him not to move. Lord Fairfield. She looked at him now directly, for the first time, as she moved through bar 15. She looked at him because the music allowed it, because the piece was in the place where it was larger than any social calculation she might make about where to direct her eyes, and so she simply looked where she looked, and where she looked was the head of the table. He was watching her with an expression that she would have, on another day, struggled to read. But the music made reading unnecessary. The music had already said everything that the room's expressions were trying to articulate. He looked like a man who had walked into his own evening and found it unexpectedly deeper than he had planned for. He looked like a man who was reassessing something, though she could not have said what. He looked, simply, as though he was in the presence of something real, and he knew it, and he was not going to look away from it. Bar 16. She played the last bar of the 7th movement. It ended on a note that was neither the loudest note she had played that evening nor the most technically demanding. It was a note that was simply, completely, entirely itself. A single pitch held for 4 beats, played at a volume that was intimate rather than large, drawn with a pressure on the bow that was firm and completely steady. She held it for the full 4 beats, and then she held it for 1 beat more, which was not in the score and which she had always done, and which she had never been able to explain except to say that the note needed it. The note had 1 more beat of life in it, and she was not going to cut it short. She held it. Then she lifted the bow. The last note died. What followed was not the pause she had created after the 2nd and 5th movements. It was something longer and more complete. It was the silence of a performance that has ended fully, not truncated, not faded, but brought to its natural and entire conclusion. The silence of something finished. It lasted. She stood with the bow at her side and the violin still tucked under her chin, and the silence lasted, and she did not move, and nobody in the room moved, and the candles burned, and somewhere in the house a clock ticked, and the city outside the drawn curtains continued to be the city, and none of that entered the room. The silence lasted for longer than she had expected. She had expected, what had she expected? She had not been thinking about what would happen after she finished. She had been thinking about the music. She had been inside the music until the bow left the strings, and then she was simply standing in a room that had been rearranged by what she had done in it. She lowered the violin from her chin. She lowered the bow to her side. She stood straight. And then Lord Fairfield stood up. He did it the way people rise who are not performing rising, without announcement. Without the social theater of pushing back a chair and straightening a jacket and adjusting to the new position. He simply stood, with the natural movement of a person who has decided that standing is what is required. His chair moved back slightly on the polished floor. The sound of it was the first sound anyone or anything in the room had made since the last note. He brought his hands together. He began to applaud. It was not the automatic applause of a polite audience. It was deliberate. It was measured. Each sound his palms made against each other was precise and unhurried, as though he were counting something, as though the applause were not just applause but also a declaration. For 3 seconds, he was the only person in the room making any sound. Then the woman with her eyes closed opened them, looked at her hands, and began to clap. Then the man with the mustache. Then the rest of the table, one by one, not all at once but in the manner of people who each come to the action independently, as their own response to their own experience of the past 30 or 40 minutes, which meant that the applause arrived in a kind of wave not planned, not performed, but genuine, each person joining it from their own private moment of returning to the room. The secretary by the door was clapping. Clara could hear it without looking. She stood. She had stood through applause before, in small concert halls, in recital rooms after conservatory performances. She knew how to stand through it, upright, present, receiving it without performing the receiving of it. You did not bow immediately. You stood first. You let the room have its response, and you received the response without rushing past it. But this was different from the applause she had stood through before. Not in volume. The room was not large enough for a great volume of sound. In quality. Specifically, in the quality of Lord Fairfield's applause, which was ongoing, which was the applause of a man who intended it to continue for as long as it required, and who had no interest in stopping before it had fully said what he meant it to say. Clara looked at him. He was still standing. He was looking at her. He was clapping, and the expression on his face was not the expression of a man performing social graciousness. It was the expression of a man who has been genuinely met by something, and who is trying, as most people try, in moments of genuine meeting, to find an adequate response, and discovering, as most people discover, that the adequate responses are very simple and very direct, and do not require anything complicated. He was giving her the simplest and most direct response he had. He was standing, and he was applauding, and he was looking at her, and he was not going to stop. She brought the bow to her side, and she lowered her chin. A bow, not a deep, theatrical bow, but an acknowledgement, a real one. The bow of a person who has given something and is receiving the recognition of having given it with gratitude and without false modesty. She straightened. The room was still clapping. Several people were now standing. The woman near the far end who had held her throat. The man who had been rolling the wine glass in his hands. Not all 12, there were those who remained seated, and whose applause was no less genuine for it, but by now the majority of the table was on its feet. Clara stood through it all. She was thinking, in some back part of her mind that was not occupied by the room, about the waltz. About the 2 copies of the waltz on the edge of the music stand in the antechamber, hers, and the one that had already been there when she arrived. She thought about the clear space on the stand above them, about the natural silence after the 8th bar, in which the only real decision of the evening had not been a decision at all but an arrival. She thought about Edna, who was in her house in the countryside and who had no idea that her student of 7 years had just played an entire piece, alone, in a nobleman's dining room, without being asked to, without a copy of the music, in front of 12 people who had come for dinner. She thought about Miriam, who would want to know everything. She thought about Gerald Hart, who had performed the piece on a stage at 19 years old in the way that had made her write his name on the back of a program ticket and keep it in the case of her violin for 7 years, and who probably had no idea that a young woman in the third row had gone home that night and begun the process of learning everything he had just done. She stood in the applause, she received it, she was grateful for it. And underneath the gratitude was something quieter and more permanent, the knowledge that the applause was not the thing. The thing had been the playing. The thing had been the fourth phrase of the sixth movement, and the seventh bar of the third, and the 16 bars of the final phrase, and the moment in the second movement when the music had asked the room to wait and the room had waited. The applause was the room's response, but the thing itself had already happened. It was already complete. It had completed itself on the last note of the seventh movement, held for one beat more than the score required, because the note had needed that beat and she had given it. That was the thing. The applause was separate from the thing and could not add to it or take from it. She knew this in the way she knew the few things she had come to know deeply enough that they were no longer beliefs, but simply facts. Music facts, life facts, the facts that live in the body rather than the mind. The applause continued. Lord Fairfield had not sat down. She looked at him again, he looked back, and he raised one hand briefly and gave a single nod, the kind of nod that is not a nod of agreement or of instruction but of recognition, of one person saying to another, "I see you, I heard you, that was real." Clara looked at him, and she nodded back. It was the first time that evening that the two of them had exchanged anything directly. Everything before this, the entry, the corner, the stand, the secretary's guidance, the dining room and its arrangements, had passed without any direct acknowledgement between them. She had been the musician. He had been the host. Those were the categories, and the categories had held. But a person who has just played something true and a person who has just heard something true are not standing in categories. They are standing in the same place, which has no category, and which very few people find their way to in any given evening or in any given life. They were standing in it now. The applause was finishing. Not abruptly, it had come in a wave, and it went out in the same way, each person's clapping slowing and stilling at their own pace. The way fires do not go out all at once but in their own time, each flame making its own decision. The room settled. Quiet arrived. Not the performance silence, the ordinary quiet of a room after something has finished. The quiet of people who are returning to themselves, still warm with the experience, not yet ready to fill it with the next thing. Lord Fairfield remained standing. He was about to speak. And Clara, who had been standing at the corner beside the bookcase through all of it, through the playing and the silence and the applause and the return of quiet, stood in the room she had rearranged, and she waited. Lord Fairfield crossed the room. He walked the length of the dining table the way a man walks when he is not performing the walking, without ceremony, without an awareness of being watched, though everyone in the room was watching. He walked like a man whose mind was already where he was going and whose body was simply catching up. He stopped in front of Clara. She was still standing by the bookcase, the violin at her side. She had not moved from the corner since she had entered the room. The music stand was still there beside her, empty now, as it had been empty from the beginning. Nothing on it, no music, just the stand. He was taller than she had estimated from across the table. He carried his size in the way of someone who has not thought about it in a very long time. His face, this close, confirmed what she had seen from the corner, a face that had lived in it, with lines that were not from worry but from use, from the particular wearing of a life that had required him to be present in rooms for many decades, and to make decisions about those rooms. He stood for a moment without speaking. She waited. "Who taught you to play?" he said. His voice was not what she had expected, though she had not been expecting anything. It was quieter than she would have guessed for a man his size. The question had no performance in it. It was simply a question, direct and genuine, asked by a person who actually wanted to know the answer. "A teacher named Edna Marsh," Clara said. He held the name for a moment. She watched him consider it, check it against whatever knowledge he had, find or not find it there. "I don't know the name," he said. "You wouldn't," Clara said. "She taught privately. She stopped performing 30 years ago." He nodded. This was information he was receiving, not information he had expected to confirm. He nodded the way people nod when they are taking something in, not when they are agreeing with it. "Where does she teach?" "In the countryside, a small house. She doesn't take many students now." "How long did you study with her?" 7 years. He looked at her, not assessing, not calculating. She was experienced enough at being looked at by people in positions of authority to know the difference between an assessing look and a looking look. This was the second kind. He was simply looking at her the way you look at something you want to understand. "You were hired for a waltz," he said. It was not a question. It was not an accusation. It was a statement, and it sat in the air between them with a particular quality. The quality of a fact that is not contested, that both parties understand in the same way. "Yes," Clara said. "You didn't play the waltz." "No." He was quiet for a moment. She could hear the rest of the room behind him, the careful absence of conversation, the held attention of people who were trying very hard not to be obviously listening, and who were obviously listening. "Why not?" he said. She thought about this, not because she didn't have an answer, but because she wanted to give the right answer rather than the first answer, and the right answer required a moment's care. She had been standing in rooms for years that had not asked for what she had to give. She had spent years learning how to give it anyway, quietly, internally, without the room knowing. And then tonight, in this room, something had shifted. "The waltz was correct," she said. "It was the right piece for the evening, for the room you'd arranged, for the guests you'd invited." She paused. "But I have been carrying something for a long time, and tonight it was finished being carried." He looked at her. "What you played," he said after a moment, "that piece, what is it?" She told him, the composer's name, the full title. He took out the small card from his breast pocket, the one she had seen him use at the table, making brief notes in a private hand, and he wrote the name down. He wrote it carefully, making sure he had it correctly, and she confirmed that he did. He put the card back in his pocket. "I've been to concerts," he said, "many, in halls considerably larger than this one, with programs and reviews and expectations." He looked past her for a moment, then back. "I have not heard what you did tonight in any of them." Clara said nothing. She received this the way she had received the applause, directly, without minimizing it, without adding to it. "You came here as a hired musician," he said. "You'll leave as something else. I want you to understand that I'm going to make sure of it." She looked at him. "I didn't play tonight to change what I am," she said. "I know," he said. He almost smiled, not quite, but the suggestion of it at the corner of his expression. "That's why it worked." She thought about that later. Not that night, but later in the days that followed, when she was back in her apartment, and the evening was behind her, and she had the space to think about it properly. She thought about what he had said, "That's why it worked," and she thought about all the evenings she had spent in rooms that had not asked for what she had to give, and she thought about the particular quality of the silence after the seventh movement's last note, and she thought about Edna in her small house in the countryside. She thought about what it meant to do the right thing, not in order to be seen doing the right thing, but because the right thing is the right thing, and how the world, on the rare occasions when you do this cleanly enough, sometimes sees it anyway. But that was later. Right now, in the dining room, with the candles burning low and the guests behind Lord Fairfield's broad back still arranged around their table in various postures of polite, barely contained attention. Right now Clara simply nodded. "Thank you," she said. He gave the nod again, the nod of recognition, steady and real. Then he turned slightly and looked at the room which was waiting. "Come and meet these people," he said. She had not expected this. She had expected to finish, to gather her things from the antechamber, to receive her fee from the secretary and make her way back across the city on the tram. She had not expected to be brought into the room as a person, not a musician, not as a participant in the evening rather than its hired background. But Lord Fairfield had already turned toward the table, and the 12 faces had rearranged themselves in the way that people's faces rearrange when something official is happening, when their host has made it clear that something is about to be introduced, and they are to receive it appropriately. Clara picked up her violin case from the floor by the bookcase. She set the violin into it carefully, the way she always set it, with the attention she always gave to the instrument, the same attention regardless of what had just preceded the setting down. She closed the case. She straightened. Then she walked toward the table. It was strange, walking toward a table you had been standing at the edge of. The room looked different from this angle, larger and at the same time more personal. The faces up close were the faces of individuals rather than an audience. The man with the gray mustache, she could see now that he was younger than she had estimated, perhaps 50 rather than 60, the mustache having added years. The woman whose eyes had been closed was looking at her with an expression of warmth that was entirely unself-conscious, the warmth of someone who has decided they are done being formal about what they feel. "This is Clara Hinton," Lord Fairfield said. He said it simply, without embellishment, just her name, as though her name was sufficient, which she understood was its own statement. The woman with the warm expression spoke first. Her name was Dorothy Wells. She said, "I have attended the summer festival for 9 years, and I have heard performances I will never forget, and what you did tonight belongs in that list." She said it the way a person says something true, plainly, without decoration. The man with the mustache introduced himself as Philip Stourton. He said, "I'm not sure I have the vocabulary for it." He said, "I think I will be thinking about the 4th phrase of the 6th movement for some time." He looked mildly embarrassed by his own precision, as though he hadn't intended to reveal that he'd been tracking the movements, and Clara liked him immediately for it. She went around the table. She shook hands. She received introductions and comments and questions, some of them more articulate than others, none of them less genuine than any. A younger man, perhaps 30, dark-haired, who had been sitting at the end nearest the secretary, asked her how long she had been working on the piece, and she told him 3 years, and he shook his head with an expression that said, "Of course." A woman named Harriet Vale asked her who had recommended her to Lord Fairfield this evening, and Clara told her, and Harriet Vale made a note on a small card of her own, the way people make notes when they intend to thank someone. She came, eventually, to Lord Fairfield himself, who had positioned himself at the foot of the table, his usual place at the head now occupied by the seat he had stood from to cross the room toward her. "I have some things to discuss with you," he said. "Not tonight. Tonight I've made you stand long enough." He glanced at the secretary. "Henry will arrange a time." "All right," Clara said. "Tomorrow evening there's a gathering at the Cavendish Hall, a small one, private. I'd like you to be there. I'd like you to play." She thought about this for one moment. "The same piece," she said. "Yes," he said, "the same piece, all of it, exactly as you played it tonight." She nodded. Henry, the secretary, was already at her elbow with a card on which he had written the address and the time. He handed it to her. She took it. She put it in her coat pocket. She thanked him. He gave a small, slightly surprised nod. She thought perhaps hired musicians did not usually thank him, or perhaps he was simply still adjusting to the events of the evening. She could not be certain. Lord Fairfield walked her out himself. down the corridor toward the main entrance, not the side entrance she had come in through, not the servant's door. He walked her to the front door, which a member of his staff opened as they approached, and she stepped out onto the stone steps in front of the house, and the evening air reached her. "Do you need a car?" he said. "No, thank you," she said. "I'll walk to the tram stop." He accepted this. He did not insist. "Then I'll say good night," he said. "Good night," she said. She walked down the steps. She heard the door close behind her. She walked along the gravel path toward the gate, which was still open, the iron panels pushed back against the wall the way they had been when she arrived, though it felt, in some way she could not entirely account for, as though she had arrived in a different evening than this one, as though the arrival and the departure belonged to different versions of the same night. She walked through the gate. She turned onto the pavement. She walked toward the tram stop, the violin case at her side, and the city was doing what it always did, moving and sounding and going about the continuous project of being itself, and she walked through it. She thought about the antechamber, about the chair and the music stand and the single high window, and the two copies of the waltz she had moved to the edge of the stand. She thought about them still sitting there, in the quiet of the empty room, while the dinner above had continued and changed and ended and turned into something it had not expected to be. She thought about whether anyone,